But because there is a new kind of faith-based movie, I thought we could talk sort of two different things. One, just take a step back and just sort of evaluate how things have been going. Check in on The Forge, which was the other most recent faith-based movie. Sort of how is it, we talked about that when it came out, but now that it's been out for a while, like how is it done in the theaters? What do we think of that? And just sort of the question that comes up, particularly with a movie like God's Not Dead, is like, who are faith-based movies for? Like, are they for the choir? Are they for Christians? Like, made by Christians, for Christians? Or should these movies be, attempting to reach a broader audience and, be accessible for a non-Christian to come and sit in and watch the movie? So we'll get to that. But kind of first, just because I hadn't really followed up on The Forge. Again, I went to the premiere in my
Swanky,
blazer,
swanky.
And I reviewed the movie. Was not a fan of the movie, but I haven't really checked in on how it's doing. And so I was looking it up just this morning, and it seems like box office wise, The Forge is now it has just crossed $20 million. So it's like $20.7 million at the box office. I know the first week that it came out weekend, it finished in the top 5. I think it was 5th, like in the top 5 of the weekly box office. And I guess to give like some context for that, like War Room by the Kendrick Brothers made $70 million. So The Forge significantly below that. Courageous in 2011 made $35 million. So this one may get close to that. Overcomer made $38 million in 2019. So I don't know. I think there's different ways to look at that. I don't know what the budget was. I'm assuming it was like $3 to $5 million. So like the movie's made money. There's no question about that. I think it's made less money than the other movies that they have made. So like I don't know if it's like there's two sides of the coin. Like it's a success, but it's maybe not as. It's also maybe the sign that like some of the interest in it is beginning to waver a bit, at least for this movie. But I thought I'd look up some other kind of faith-based movies that I've actually enjoyed a lot more this year. Like Cabrini, which through Angel Studios, which made $20 million, but cost $50 million. Sort of that's the downside of making a beautiful movie. Where you go on location, is that it wasn't financially successful, even if I thought it was a good movie. Sight, which another Angel Studios movie I enjoyed, made $7 million. So again, didn't make a whole lot of noise at the box office. Unsung Hero, which again, another faith-based movie that I enjoyed quite a bit, made $17 million. So again, less. So I don't know, what are your just in some of the box office stuff, like it seems like if nothing else, it shows like there's still a market for sort of the Kendrick Brothers brand of movies, even if maybe that market is slightly smaller than it once was.
Yeah, I'm sure the argument could also be made that all of the other 3 movies that you mentioned from them all came out before COVID. So I'm sure in defense of the low numbers that you could say, well, movies just aren't making as much as they used to. So that would be one maybe possible defense of the less than ideal money making from that. But it does show that there is certainly money to be made. And I think it's very clear that there is a market and an audience for these types of films. As much as we ourselves personally may not love these movies or maybe necessarily see a point to them, I think it is clear that there are people who want to see these movies, or at least will pay to see these movies, and it may, it may be more of a duty thing that a lot of these folks are going to the theater than it is necessarily like this is a great movie that I've been anxiously.
I think there are people that they support the faith-based movie because they want to see more like this.
Yeah,
not necessarily that this movie itself. Kind of one caveat. Which just seems like it's, again, if you're not as like plugged into the industry, this might not be something that you think of, but like I think box office is overall is not the best judge for. I mean, it definitely doesn't. Like opening weekend doesn't say really anything about the quality of a movie.
Yeah,
like I know a lot of people almost equivalent like it made this much money, it's a good movie, which again isn't necessarily. I think the overall like lifetime money a movie makes says something, but like no one that went if a movie makes $15 million opening weekend, no one that bought a ticket knows if that movie is good or not. Like, I
Yeah.
think how good a movie does initially reflects the marketing. Like,
Right.
was there enough hype, to get people into the theaters? I think what is more telling for like quality is like what's the drop off? Like, what are the next
Yeah.
couple weeks? Like, is there a word of mouth? Like, is the reviews come out and there's there's some buzz to this movie, and you sort of see some of the real good movies that get traction and have a long life, and week after week they're still kind
Yeah.
of crushing. Like, that reflects more of the movie's good. Like, just the opening weekend, I think it's a good achievement, but doesn't necessarily reflect sort of quality of the movie. And I think that's a segue to like again, like, I thought The Forge was not a good movie.
Yeah.
And to sort of, if you haven't seen my review for God's Not Dead, I think it is a worse movie than The Forge. This movie, one of my least favorite movies I've seen this year. Like,
Yeah.
it's just bad. Like, from almost any metric, any perspective. Like, I try and give every movie like the benefit of the doubt, and like be fair, and like go into it. Like, I'm gonna like this movie, and it has to prove me otherwise. And this movie proved me
Time and again.
otherwise. And I was kind of thinking about it because I was like, overall, I feel like I've been pretty positive in my reviews about faith-based movies. Like, I feel like this year there's been a bunch of them, and even movies like there was like that sort of real cornball, like Christmas musical Christian thing, and I thought it was fine. I feel like I was one of the few people that are like, it's cheesy, it's sort of lame, but like it's fine. Like, I feel like I've been mostly positive, and then like The Forge, and then God's Not Dead 5, not good reviews. It's like, well, which maybe makes it seem like I'm more grumpy to these movies than I am. It's like, well, I'm really not. But I think maybe the common denominator for these types of movies is that they're the two movies that are like sort of the old school, the old guard of like they predate like Angel Studios or Kingdom Story Group or sort of this new wave of faith-based stuff. Like,
Yeah.
the Kendrick brothers have been making movies for over a decade. God's Not Dead, the original one, came out like 10 years ago, and there's this thing about sort of that where they feel like a throwback. In a not a good way, like like an older era, like a relic that we've sort of moved past, and like they're kind of keeping the good fight going.
Yeah.
And I think there's issues with these types of movies, and I feel like it's a carryover to sort of these mindsets that I feel like maybe we've mostly kind of grown out of. And I guess the question for us is like, what is that element? Because one of the things I've seen, especially with the Forge movie, like people that have agreed with me that, hey, this isn't great cinema. One of the criticisms that I've seen kind of pop up a bunch is sort of this question that like, or this critique that like, this is just preaching to the choir. Like, I wish these movies would be more accessible to non-Christians. Like, this seems like, like people sort of will dismiss a movie like The Forge, saying like no one that's not at their local church 2 or 3 times a week are gonna go to this movie theater.
Yeah.
Like, no one's stumbling into God's Not Dead 5. I mean, like, well, I hate God, and I'm an atheist, but this just seemed like a good story. Like, it's very much aimed at Christians.
Yeah.
Exclusively Christians. And I guess the question for us is like, is that okay? Like, do faith-based movies, like kind of art, like, do they need to be accessible to wide audiences, or like, is it okay to just kind of preach to the choir now and then? Like, what is your...
Yeah, I think it's totally fine to make a movie for a specific audience. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, we see it all the time from, cartoons or, like video game movies, for example. Like, those don't necessarily have a super wide audience. And there's a lot of movies that are made sort of in service of the fans of a particular brand or franchise or property, what have you. And so I think it's totally legitimate to make movies for a particular group of people. I think I have no problem with movies being made for the church, by and for the church. I think my issue with it are maybe twofold. One, don't pretend like you're making this to like combat Hollywood. Like, this is the church's answer to like unholy movies that we see coming out of Hollywood, because it's not. Like, that's not what it is. And don't pretend like this is some evangelistic outreach kind of thing, because it clearly is not. And I think, two, if you're going to use a particular art medium to convey a message, respect that art medium. And I think movies like God's Not Dead and The Forge don't respect the medium that they're working with, which is cinema, film, because nothing about these movies are really cinematic, or really you don't get the sense that they care about the fact that it's a movie. It's like, we care that it's a message that we're going to send to the church, not so much that this is going to be a really compelling story, or it's shot in a really beautiful way, or we give any sort of thought to, the makings of the movie.
Yeah, because I think one of the, like you said, that they're not cinematic. I think people can confuse that. 'Cause I even say that in my reviews. Like, there's just nothing really cinematic. All the cinematic qualities seem to be pushed to the side for the purpose of the message. Like, what I don't mean with that is like The Forge doesn't need a bunch of like CGI spectacle,
No,
third
no.
act, beam in the sky, alien. Like, it's not cinematic in terms of like big, expensive, flashy. It's more just like you said, like the language of film, like the way
Right.
that character development goes, or like story arc, or the way that you craft the scenes to flow in such a way that you sort of tug on emotion and you sort of take people on a journey. Like,
Right.
that's more what I mean by cinematic. Like,
Yeah.
this is sort of the way that movies work and why they're powerful. Not that they're flashy, but they work with the story in a particular way.
Because you can make you can make a fantastic movie, for next to nothing, and it can be very cinematic.
Well, and faith-based films this year have been cinematic. Like,
Yeah.
like Sight, or Unsung Hero, the ones we mentioned earlier, Cabrini, like those were cinematic. Like, they're
Yeah.
there's weren't perfect movies, but they did some of that. Because I'm with you. Like, I think that's almost like aiming our scorn or our critiques at the wrong thing. Like, for me, I have no problem with a movie being for a particular audience.
Yeah.
Like, like I write books, like my new book, Straight to the Heart, available on Amazon. Like, that's a book written to Christians. Like,
Yeah.
Not even necessarily like, seeking spiritual people, like for Christians. This is like, as Christians, how do we, engage with culture? And
Yeah.
and like I don't think I need to make, that accessible to, but if you don't believe in God, like, here's, this other track you can go on, or, make it
Yeah.
evangelistic, because that's not what it's for. Like, or like worship music. Like, I don't think anyone that's not a Christian is going to tune on, The Fish and listen to Christian worship music.
Right.
Because it's not for them. Like, they're singing about stuff that they don't even believe in.
Yeah.
And we don't necessarily have a problem with that. Like, so I think the reason why movies like The Forge or God's Not Dead 5 aren't good is not that they're preaching to the choir. I think the reason they're bad is that there are some tendencies that can slip in when you're preaching to the choir that make for bad art. Like, I think
Yeah.
there's this pull towards more like propaganda art than art, where it's like, well, if we're just sort of preaching to the choir, then one, we're preaching, and that doesn't always make good art. And there's just not very much incentive to, like, you don't need to win people over, because like,
Right.
like The Forge doesn't necessarily need to win people over with the story, because they're trying to win people over with, this movie is about discipleship, you believe in discipleship. This movie is about Jesus, you love Jesus, like, so you're already on board with what we're doing.
Right.
And they don't necessarily care if they, well, should we also like really think how we frame this camera scene, like how we work on their emotions, because there's this built-in assumption
Yeah.
that like
Should we show and not tell? Like it is.
never
It is a visual medium after all.
tell, and if you have to, by necessity.
And I think, to your point, like, you wrote a book with your brother, but it didn't mean that you did a lazy job or a bad job, or you didn't get it edited. It's like, we wouldn't tolerate this sort of, less than good use of a particular medium. Like, we don't, if someone wrote a book that was just poorly written, filled with typos, kind of confusing, but it's like, well, but they love Jesus, so I guess I'll read it or try to. Like, you just wouldn't do that. And the same with music, and the same with, visual art, like paintings and stuff. Like, we're not going to hang art in our churches.
Yeah, you're
It's
not
like,
listening
well,
to a tone-deaf singer. Like,
yeah,
you're not,
like, yeah.
regardless of how many times he says
Sunday
hallelujah
morning
in the chorus.
services, yeah, Sunday morning services are filled with people who are good at music. It's not filled with people who have a good heart but can't carry a tune in a bucket. But again, and we've said this before, but somehow that gets lost when it comes to movie making.
Yeah, and I think kind of with the God's Not Dead movie, like I think there's a way to preach to the choir that doesn't sort of dumb it down,
Yeah.
and doesn't like I think art just doesn't always turn out well if you're trying to give people exactly what they want. And not
Yeah.
challenge them. I think what makes art powerful is when you can challenge them. And like a movie like God's Not Dead, In God We Trust, like very much like about as simplistic as you can get. Like if the character's a Christian, then they're like saintly, and like their only conflict is just how bad everyone else in the world is around them, and like how bad the government is. Like, and if they're not a Christian, like oh boy, like these are the biggest jerks you have ever met. Like there's nothing redeemable about these people. They're not even humans. Like it's very much, I think, in a very like almost like sinful way, dehumanizing the non-Christian characters. Like where it's not just like they just don't feel like real people. Like they feel like caricatures of these angry, God-hating, slimy, sleazy, kind of politicians and stuff. And I feel like because you don't know you need to. Because if a movie like that's attempting to just sort of, hey, we get pleasure at seeing heroic Christians just sort of slam dunk on on all these dumb atheists, then like that's all you need to do. Like I feel like what these sort of movies lack, which makes some of the other faith-based movies I think better, is this sort of some of that more like complicated emotions or complicated experience. Like we were talking before we even recorded this. Like, yeah, hey, you have an atheist character, you have the villain in the story, like he can still be God hating and like he can still be the adversary, but like hey, give him a daughter that he loves, or like like give him something that humanizes him in a way that it's like okay, maybe not everyone that we disagree with just walks around insulting people and hating life and these bitter like,
Kicking puppies.
yes, it's like maybe they disagree with us and they're also people and they have their own story
And they have reasons to disagree, not just because
maybe
they're
they have
just...
trauma in their past that makes them they hated their father because he abused them and now they hate the idea of God as the father. Like there's more nuance to it.
Yeah.
But because I think where these movies go off trail is this the reluctance to do that. It's not that they're preaching to the choir. It's that in preaching to the choir, they're just settling for very simplistic stories that demands absolutely nothing from the viewer beyond kind of passively feeling good that our side won the fight.
Yeah.
So again, you can check out my full review. It might be one of the more negative, might be the most negative review I've done in quite a while for that movie. But hey, if you want to hear some of my thoughts, and even why I think the message, like I criticize the movie as a movie, but I also criticize the message as the message. And I think there's some issues with the message of the movie that even if you don't even care about the movie, or if you do like the movie and you just want to hear a different perspective on why the message isn't as grand as it might seem, check out my review and join the conversation on that.